From the Watson School of International and Public Affairs at Brown University, this is Trending Globally. I'm Dan Richards. When President Trump took office in January, Congress seemed poised to play a supporting role in the story of Trump's second term. Republicans largely fell in line behind President Trump's cabinet nominees and behind much of his broader agenda. It's been reported that Trump himself has joked that he's both the president and the Speaker of the House. Congressional Democrats, meanwhile, appeared helpless to mount a vigorous opposition to Trump's policies, or even to energize their own base. But this fall, those dynamics in Congress began to shift. Congressional Republicans have stood up to Trump on several key issues, including, most notably, the release of files related to the Jeffrey Epstein case. And Congressional Democrats galvanized supporters around this fall's government shutdown fight over the future of ACA health insurance subsidies. So what to make of this more assertive stance we're seeing on both sides of the aisle in Congress? Why are we seeing this happen right now? And what does it tell us about Congress, the president, and the American voters? To help answer these questions, I spoke with two experts about the shifting role of Congress in U.S. politics as Trump enters his lame duck phase and America gears up for a midterm election that's less than 12 months away. We also discussed Congress's consistently low approval ratings among Americans, how the race to gerrymander districts affects those currently serving in office, and what, if anything, could be done to make Congress work better under a Trump administration and after it. Eric Potashnick is a political scientist and director of the Watson School's Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy, and Congresswoman Kathy Manning represented North Carolina's 6th District from 2020 to 2024 and is now a senior fellow in international and public affairs at the Watson School. Here is our conversation. Eric Potashnick and Representative Kathy Manning, thank you both so much for coming on to Trending Globally.
Pleasure to be here.
Happy to be with you.
So I want us to take a closer look at sort of the role of Congress in our politics right now, both in terms of the making of legislation and policy, but also how Congress is shaping the Democrats and Republican parties as they're sort of envisioning their futures. And I was thinking we could start actually back with the fallout of the government shutdown this fall, which ran for, 43 days and ended when 8 Democratic senators voted with Republicans to reopen the government without agreeing to an extension of ACA healthcare subsidies, which had been the Democrats' sort of chief demand in these negotiations. So in other words, the government reopened without Democrats getting what they were fighting for. But on the other hand, a lot of people point out that this brought attention to issues that Democrats really want on the table, healthcare, cost of living, and that this benefited Democrats. What do you see as the political fallout from this historically long shutdown? Were there winners? Were there losers? How do you think about it?
First of all, let me make it clear that it was the American people who lost, because we had federal workers who were out of work, who were not getting paid, who were worried about paying their rent, buying groceries. Even those who will now be paid, now that the government is open, some of those payments have been made up, some of them have been delayed, but that caused enormous stress on people. We also saw federal contractors who didn't get paid, and that money will not be repaid. They actually lost work, and that work won't be made up. Then we had the impact on the American people in general, who lost federal services, everything from national parks to the airport delays that were really terrible. So the American people lose during a shutdown. With regard to which party won, while the Democrats did not get agreement to renew the subsidies, the ACA subsidies that help people afford their healthcare premiums, the Democrats definitely focused everyone's attention on the high cost of healthcare. It also became quite apparent to President Trump, who is now doesn't have his own plan after all these years saying he could fix the problem, but he has said that there needs to be an extension of those premiums, and he is pushing for somebody to come up with ideas for how we can bring down healthcare costs. So in that respect, I think that the Democrats made their point.
And so if they made their point and they were effective in that, why did they let the shutdown end if they were on the right path gaining attention to these issues?
I think you have to look at the Democrats that voted with the Republicans. What states were they from? Are they from states that are very purple states? Are they people who either had just won difficult elections or are up for re-election? And are they people who, when they went home, their constituents made it quite clear to them that they needed the government open again? And I suspect if you go through all 8 of those, you'll find that most of them fall into those categories.
Eric?
I think it's important to see that the most recent shutdown, although the particulars were different, are very much illustrative of patterns we've seen in American history in the past. As Kathy said, in general, shutdowns do inflict significant economic and social costs due to furloughed workers and lost revenue and disrupted services. And the pattern has been that they seldom result in the party that initiated the standoff achieving its primary policy goals. And this has been the pattern that we've seen time and time again in American political history. The American political system, Congress, is so fragmented, and there are so many different actors who have come from different parts of the country, different districts. They have different electoral circumstances. It's extremely difficult for one party to maintain the unity over time, to stick together when the costs begin to mount.
This shutdown, as you both say, it did help bring attention to certain issues that Democrats care about, but at a great cost to Americans. I wonder, do you think there are ways, either examples from the past or examples you saw when you were serving in Congress, Kathy, that the party that is out of power can sort of sustain that type of energy and create that type of focus without doing something as drastic as a shutdown? Because given the way that the shutdown ended in the fall, there's actually a possibility that if Democrats and Republicans can't, come together as soon as January, we could see another shutdown standoff. Are there other ways to keep that attention?
I think as we move from now on to the midterms, we're going to see that the Democrats continue to talk about healthcare costs. They're going to be talking about costs there because right now the 3 things that Americans are most concerned about are the cost of groceries, the cost of healthcare, and the cost of utilities. And we're going to see Democrats talking about that nonstop from now until the midterms. That's what I think you're going to see is as Democrats go back to their districts, they're going to be talking about costs in general, but they'll keep talking about those healthcare costs.
And I think the issue to look for is how do they talk about them? And so there is a little bit of a divide within the Democratic Party about the approach that should be taken. So Bernie Sanders, for example, would like the party to go big on healthcare. He wants the Democrats not only to propose extending the enhanced tax credits under the ACA, but to advocate for repealing the $1 trillion in GOP healthcare cuts, to expand Medicare, to lower prescription drug prices. Other more moderate Democrats are more focused just on the ACA and more incremental reforms for controlling healthcare costs. And so I think that is going to be something to watch. Can the Democratic Party unify around a single message on healthcare and bring the party together, or will we see some of these divides even within the party continue?
Well, and in terms of how to not just keep talking about these issues, but doing it in a way that gets people to really listen. I think bringing it to your district, I think is a great example. But I wonder also, if you two were advising congressional Democrats, would you suggest putting the country through another shutdown if it meant keeping these issues as top of mind as they were for, certain Americans in October and November?
I don't think I would advise another shutdown. I think we saw the impact that had, and ultimately we saw that it was Democrats who saved the government by reopening. So I would not advocate for another shutdown. And I also think the pain is too great. But I think they ought to highlight what's happening to people across the country who are losing their health care. And we're seeing this in a lot of red states, not just in the blue states, not just in the purple states, but the rural areas are being very heavily affected. And there are hospitals in some of the western states where literally women have to drive for hours to go someplace where they can deliver their babies rather than going to the local hospital. So we're going to see the impact, and I think we will see Democrats talking about the impact it's having on people in rural areas and in red states.
And I don't think we should dismiss how difficult the current situation is for the Republican Party. They are really facing a difficult choice because many of their own constituents are facing real cuts. But it's extremely difficult for Republicans to support, in their view, throwing more money at the ACA. This is a law they've strongly opposed since its initiation. And so I think that's another reason why it has been so difficult for them to coalesce around a unified position. They simply can't easily reconcile their philosophical commitments with the implications for their own constituents. And so part of what the Democrats have to do is keep talking about healthcare costs, but also get out of the way a little bit because the Republicans themselves are bringing attention to that issue by their own inability to reach consensus.
I think Eric has hit the nail on the head. They are philosophically opposed to what the ACA represents, and they have not been able to come up with anything better.
You know, I want to talk more a little bit later about some of the ways you both think Congress may be able to become a more effective creator of policy. But I want to turn now to some of the other issues and challenges we're seeing on the Republican side of the aisle in Congress and kind of what they tell us about our politics right now. There have been a few high-profile examples lately of President Trump clashing with members of his own party in Congress in a way that is a little unusual. You know, one example came during the shutdown when Trump suggested that the Senate should get rid of the filibuster, which Republican senators, refused to do. And then, of course, the Trump administration gave into Congress's wishes, demands to release more documents regarding the Jeffrey Epstein case, which Trump had also, opposed. And in these moments, I wonder, do you both see sort of these as isolated instances of like uniquely difficult conflicts? Or are we seeing, as some observers are pointing out, perhaps a shift in power between Congress and Trump as Trump's presidency kind of continues on and we get closer to the midterms?
Well, certainly there are Republicans who are becoming more and more concerned about the midterms. And when they go home over the summer, it was almost comical to watch the clips of the Republicans who were brave enough to have town halls and just got slammed by constituents calling them screaming, yelling. One of the members of Congress who took part of my district in the gerrymandering was quite open. She said, well, why would I want to have a town hall? All my constituents are just going to yell at me. Which was, she said the quiet part out loud. And so the Republicans have stayed in line pretty much for the first, let's say, 7 or 8 months of the Trump administration. But we're seeing cracks. And the Epstein situation was so interesting because the part of the Republican faction that caused the most problems, that stirred the pot the most on the Epstein documents, were the hardcore far-right MAGA people. Think of Marjorie Taylor Greene.
I won my first election without his endorsement, beating 8 men in a primary. And I've never owed him anything, but I fought for him for the policies and for America first. And he called me a traitor for standing with these women.
Who just announced she would be stepping down.
And I suspect there's some big TV contract waiting for her somewhere. But if you think about the fact that many of those on the far right, they came to Congress believing that there's this big conspiracy out there and that Trump was going to be their champion in creating transparency and revealing the ugly underbelly of that big conspiracy that was out there. And they see Epstein as sort of the tip of the sword of the conspiracy theory. And so when Trump was dragging his heels on revealing those files, some of those people couldn't understand why was he not their champion in this, and they really pushed on those Epstein files. So I think what that showed was there are different factions in the Republican Party, and they're starting to separate.
How much do you think that starting to separate, though, is the result of just the intensity of this particular issue, the Epstein case? And how much might it be the result of the fact that Trump is a second-term president who is ostensibly not going to run for a third term? Like, would this be different if he was a year into his first term, do you think, in terms of how much he might be able to really keep his party in line?
I think there's several factors. I think the Epstein issue was uniquely powerful to the base. It's just explosive. This was not something that was constructed. This has been an organic concern of a mass constituency for a long period of time.
Not just among the Republicans either.
That's right.
Yeah.
And deeply felt. Many Americans have been concerned about this for a long period of time. We also have the recent results of the off-year elections where the Democrats performed much better than expected. And so it's also those signs, the fact that Trump's approval rating is low. Polls show that the generic congressional ballot is very favorable to the Democrats. Democrats are quite likely to retake the House in 2026. The Senate remains more of an uphill battle, but it is possible. And so you put all that together along with the fact that Trump is a lame duck, and that is allowing some of the pre-existing tensions within the conservative community to surface. And one of the ways Trump's been extraordinary is his personal charisma and appeal has allowed diverse set of actors to remain broadly behind him. And these include religious conservatives, evangelicals, fundamentalists, people who are concerned about abortion as their top issue, businesses that want tax cuts and deregulatory relief, people that want to see a less interventionist foreign policy, people that are concerned about vaccines. Some people are futurists and believe that AI is going to lead to nirvana, and other people believe that tech companies are the source of all evil. It is no easy political trick to keep all of those factions and groups more or less on side. But as we get closer to the day when he leaves the political scene, there may not be another actor that is able to maintain that level of unity. It seems clear that Vice President Vance is trying hard to be that actor, but he doesn't have the political appeal among those constituencies that Donald Trump does. And so as we get closer to the end of Donald Trump's second administration, those tensions are going to continue to emerge.
I'd also point out that we're starting to see the impact of some of the cabinet members that Donald Trump was able to push through against the wishes of some of the senators who ended up voting for those people who are now, I suspect, agonizing over their yes votes. And I would give as an example, Senator Cassidy, a doctor from Louisiana, who is now seeing that RFK Jr. actually lied to him about whether he would support vaccine science.
How worried are you that this change to the CDC's website and Secretary Kennedy's other actions are going to result in more dead Americans?
Anything that undermines the understanding, the correct understanding, the absolute scientifically based understanding that vaccines are safe and that if you don't take them, you're putting your child or yourself in greater danger. Anything that underlines that message is a problem.
And also, I think we've seen the worst year for measles in maybe 30 years. And so Senator Cassidy is starting to get more and more concerned about what did his yes vote on RFK Jr. do to this country? Senator Wicker, who is chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, is now expressed significant alarm about the attacks on small vessels that Hegseth is having shot down in the Caribbean and also now in the Pacific. And Senator Wicker and also the ranking member on that committee have expressed extreme alarm that those are war crimes. So I think we're seeing some of the senators start to be very uncomfortable about what are these Trump appointees actually doing to our country and to the real world, and how are they going to be held accountable for those things?
It's such a great point, and sort of ironic too, because I think the way that Congress approved so many of these candidates at the beginning of Trump's term was like one of the defining symbols of Trump's dominance over the party, that he could get through all these people, and that might be just coming home to roost now.
Absolutely.
You know, as we're talking about sort of the shape and the future of both parties, an issue that's kind of running under all of American politics and electoral politics right now as well is the issue of gerrymandering and the race to redistrict states across the country. You know, there have been efforts in states not only, but including Virginia, Ohio, Texas, California, Indiana to, redraw their congressional maps.
Don't forget North Carolina.
North Carolina, absolutely, yes, and I want to talk to you about that. But a number of these efforts have been challenged in court, so it's unclear at the moment. It seems what party's going to be the biggest beneficiary, but it's clear it's going to be shaping the midterms in some way. Before I ask you more specifically, Kathy, about North Carolina, I was wondering if you could give listeners a little bit of an explanation, just why is this happening right now? Because normally redistricting happens in the aftermath or in the wake of the census every 10 years or so. But is that not always the case? And if so, why is it happening now? And what does it tell us about this moment?
It is unusual. And so, I think Donald Trump set this off by claiming that Republicans were entitled to more seats.
He did that this year.
Yeah, in Texas. And so that led to Democratic states like California to try to counteract that pressure. We're sort of in now what I think scholars would call a sort of bad equilibrium. In an ideal world, neither party would be playing these games. We would be better off as a democracy if we did not do mid-cycle redistricting, and probably if we relied on independent commissions to draw lines. And if both parties played that strategy, like I will cooperate and I will do that if you do that, then democracy would be better off. The problem is once one party, in this case the Republicans, went first and said we are going to renege on that sort of deal, we're not going to follow the normal rules of doing it once per decade, then the Democrats have to sort of fight fire with fire, which is not the best outcome, but it's probably a better outcome than having only one party do that. And so we're not in a great place, but it's a better place, I think, than if the Democrats just sort of completely laid down their arms. And so it's an ugly kind of politics. It's nobody's idea of the way democracy should work, but we're not only a polarized country right now, we're also a very closely divided country. And once you have the leader of one party sort of saying, pedal to the metal, let's push this as far as we can go, it's sort of almost inevitable that the other party is going to do the same thing.
Mm.
I want to sort of take a step back for people who are listening to this who are not as completely engrossed in gerrymandering as the three of us are.
Yes, please take us a step back.
Gerrymandering is a process by which elected officials use highly sophisticated computer systems to create districts that they believe, based on those highly sophisticated computer systems which analyze past voting data, districts that they believe will allow them to basically choose their voters. So elected officials get to choose their voters rather than voters in sort of equally determined districts choosing their representatives. Now, the Supreme Court had the opportunity to solve this problem in a case brought by North Carolinians, but they decided that that this was a political question, that the Supreme Court was not going to step in and determine that political gerrymandering violated due process or equal protection or anything else in the Constitution. I think the only way we're going to solve this problem is right now we're in a race to the bottom. We're seeing all states that can redraw maps jumping in and doing that. And until the Republicans and the Democrats reach a situation of mutually assured destruction, they are not going to make a change.
Kathy, you were elected to Congress representing North Carolina's 6th district, a district which includes the city of Greensboro, in 2020. But in 2023, your district was redrawn, gerrymandered, effectively, by the GOP-controlled North Carolina General Assembly. And I really want to hear from you a little bit about how that experience played out, for you as someone serving in Congress, not just how it affected maybe the election, but how it sort of shaped your time in Congress and maybe how it might be shaping representatives in other seats that are on the cusp of maybe sort of being radically redrawn. But let's start with your experience.
Sure. So when I was elected in 2020, the way the North Carolina 6th district had been drawn, and it's been our congressional districts have been redrawn, I think, every 2 years since 2000, either 13 or 16.
Wow.
But when I ran in 2020, the district I had, you could call it the Triad District: Greensboro, High Point, Winston-Salem. 3 urban areas that are truly communities of interest, have very common business sectors, common issues all across the district. The map was redrawn to gerrymander me out. In other words, to split the district. It divided up the Democrats so that I couldn't win again. A lawsuit was brought. It went to the North Carolina Supreme Court. The North Carolina Supreme Court said that the extreme partisan gerrymandering, it described it as being done with surgical precision, that violated the North Carolina state constitution. It prevented the vote of every voter from counting. So they threw the maps to a 3-judge panel. My district changed slightly. I picked up 2 rural counties, but I was still able to win. I spent a lot of time going out to those 2 rural counties to meet people, to understand what their issues were, to figure out how I could serve them as well as I was serving the area that I knew very well. The district were then redrawn again before the 2024 election, but this time we had lost the North Carolina Supreme Court. And this time the court said we were wrong in our prior decision. Political gerrymandering is just fine in North Carolina. So that's how we ended up with new maps once again. And this time they divided not just Guilford County in 3 pieces. They divided the city of Greensboro. Each piece of the former district was then connected to far-flung rural districts, so that it gave a Republican a 15 to 16 point advantage in each of the 3 pieces of my old district. And after looking at the numbers, looking at each of the 3 pieces of the district, analyzing who the voters were, how many of them had I served, no more than 35% of any of the 3 districts had I previously served. So in other words, I would have had to introduce myself to more than 60% of the voters in any of those 3 districts. They would not have known me. Most of them were not even in our TV district, so that they wouldn't have seen me being interviewed on TV. They wouldn't have heard about the work I was doing. So it was basically the decision that I made. It was a pretty agonizing decision because I loved representing my community. But when you run for office, you have to get a whole team of people to help you. You have to get people who are willing to knock on doors for you, and people who are willing to make phone calls, people who are willing to write postcards and hold meet and greets for you. And of course, you have to get people to give you money so you can put your ads on TV and across social media. And I thought about what would it be like for me to call these people and say, I need your help. I know I'm going to lose this race, but I still need your help. And I just felt like I couldn't do it with integrity. I couldn't ask people to invest in a race that I knew we were going to lose. I just didn't feel like it was honest and it wasn't fair.
Do you think that a lot of people in Congress are sort of experiencing their own potential versions of what you experienced, given all the states that are doing this type of surgical redistricting right now?
I do think that a lot of people are going through it. I just read in one of the news reports this morning that Darrell Issa, a congressman from California who served for a while, then lost an election, then won again. I heard that he's actually thinking about moving to Texas, from California to Texas, to run in one of those gerrymandered seats. Now, I don't know if it's true, but it was sort of an extreme example of somebody facing the fact that he couldn't win in his own community anymore because of the way the maps had been drawn. So
wait, so he's a California representative, and his district in all of this, in an effort to gain more Democrats, was gonna negatively affect him.
Exactly. Now, I don't know if it's true, but it was a reputable source. It is the most extreme example of somebody facing defeat, trying to figure out how can I keep my job in Congress. I suspect he won't do it, but I know not only are people having to face tough decisions, but Democrats are being drawn what they call double bunked. 2 members of Congress being drawn into the same district where they have to fight it out. And we're seeing some of that happening. But we're also seeing people retire, like Marjorie Taylor Greene. That was a whole different reason that she retired. But we're seeing other people who are retiring because either they know they can't win or they just can't take what's going on anymore because they don't feel productive. Jared Golden, who is a Democrat, he won the most Republican seat of any of the other Democrats, and he represents an area in Maine. And he's probably the only Democrat who could ever win that seat. And he just decided not to run again. And he said he's not being productive and he'd rather spend the time with his family. And it was really personally sad to me because I think he's been a really good member of Congress, represented his district extremely well. But I can understand the frustration because he probably, as he said, he just didn't feel like it was worth the time and effort he was putting in to get nothing done.
It's a pretty disheartening image, people wanting to serve and maybe being turned away from an incredibly important role in our society. I mean, it almost sounds like a death spiral of some sort of an institution that's struggling to be productive and have, respect and trust. And so then a lot of respected and trustworthy people leave. And then,
I think Congress has always been an institution that people have looked at with, to say the least, mixed views. It is nothing new to have low public approval of Congress. That goes back all the way to Tocqueville and to the beginning of the Republic. And that is because Congress is a representative body, and we are a large, diverse country. And Congress is the place where we try to negotiate agreements among people who have different interests and values. And so in some ways, there's nothing really new about this at all. But I do think there are ways in which Congress's overall standing in the political system has declined, and that should concern us. So for many decades, Congress has delegated much of its foreign policy making authority to the executive. That really goes back all the way to World War II and the Cold War, and Congress has not played the leading role in foreign policy for a very long time. But Congress was still what the founders intended it to be, which was the chief domestic policymaker. It was the lawmaking institution. But that has begun to change in recent decades. As we've had more gridlock, more polarization, it's been harder for Congress to tackle some of the major issues facing the country. What we've seen is more Congress being unable to legislate, and therefore presidents using executive orders and other kinds of means to make major policy decisions. We saw that during the Biden administration with things like student debt relief. And, that should have been a policy that Congress should have addressed. And we've certainly seen that in spades under the second Trump administration, where one policy after another is made by the White House without congressional input. And, we've seen effort by President Trump to grab authority in areas like tariffs and deportations and budget authority and canceling spending without any congressional input. de facto dismantling cabinet agencies by furloughing and getting rid of staff in ways that Congress did not endorse. And Congress has not come together to think about how it can reclaim its rightful place in the political system. And so we're focused very much on the second Trump administration, but this is a set of challenges that will outlast the Trump administration. The need for Congress to regain its appropriate place in the political system.
As, close observers, experts, former members of Congress, is there anything you think could be done, within Congress to help rebuild its reputation, and not just PR, but ideally make it sort of function in a way that is more in line with what I think Americans might hope from it? Is there anything that can be done from inside the body, rules or reforms you'd like to see? Or is it really something that comes from the outside?
I think there are some reforms. Some of them may require bipartisan support, and so there'll be an uphill battle. But we know, for example, that members of Congress are spending a larger and larger proportion of their time fundraising. And political scientists have documented just the sheer amount of time has grown exponentially over recent decades. Some political scientists believe that we should actually allow political parties, to raise more funds so that they can be the chief fundraising vehicle and not individual members. And I think we're going to have to see an effort to reclaim the power of the purse. That is absolutely should be Congress's fundamental power. And it has been chipped away at in this administration. And it remains unclear just how far the Supreme Court will go in redrawing the balance of power between the executive and Congress over things like whether a president can cancel spending and not give Congress enough time to consider rescissions and things like that. But if Congress does not hold the purse strings, its ability to be the dominant policymaking institution will decline significantly. And so I think that has to be looked at. Congress needs more staff. It needs more help. The Supreme Court
Kathy, you're nodding enthusiastically.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so the Supreme Court has basically said that it's going to expect Congress to write more detailed laws. It's going to defer less to the way in which agencies interpret statutes. The Supreme Court thinks that's too much authority for the bureaucracy. And so it's really going to be up to Congress to write laws in the areas of climate and healthcare and education. These are very complicated areas. And Congress needs more help than it currently has. Staff salaries. I was a congressional staffer a long time ago, and staff salaries really have not kept up with professional salaries in related fields. And so that has to be looked at.
Don't forget members of Congress's salaries have not kept up. The members of Congress have not had a raise, I think, since 2010. And the same year that Congress decided that it would not give itself a raise and it would not give federal judges a raise, federal judges brought a lawsuit. They won. So federal judges now get much higher salaries. They've gotten cost of living raises every year since then as a result of the lawsuit. Members of Congress have not gotten cost of living raises. And there are many members of Congress who I know struggle to, you have to have some place to live in Washington when you're there on a regular basis. And I've seen the way some members of Congress live, and some of them live in their offices. Others live in what looks like a college dorm situation because they can't afford to keep a place at home in their district and take care of their kids and elderly parents. And I mean, to the average person, the congressional salary probably sounds very high, but it's not compared to what these people could make if they had jobs with commensurate responsibility in the private sector. And we want to make sure we're getting really good people to run for Congress who can afford to support their families.
And what is the salary for a member of Congress?
$174,000. And $174,000 to the average salary in my district is less than half of that. So to most people, that sounds like a lot of money, but most people aren't having to have two places that they live, support their selves in Washington and in their local district. And look, that's not the primary issue. I think the concerns that Eric has laid out are far more important.
And how did you see these issues, Kathy? Whether we're talking about the pay or the, constant demand for fundraising or the stress of navigating gerrymandering. How do some of these issues kind of manifest within Congress? Really thinking of it as an institution made up of people just doing a job, an important job, but it's a job. How did you see these issues affect people you worked with?
Because of all the fundraising that is done, because of the unpredictable schedule in Congress, it's supposed to be you're in session for 3 weeks and then you're home in your district for 1 week. It has rarely worked that way. At least it didn't work that way for the 4 years I was in Congress. So it's stressful on the family, but also it doesn't give you a lot of time when you're in Washington to get to know other members of Congress. And people always talk about in years gone by, people moved their families to Washington, they socialized with each other outside of Congress, so they actually got to know each other more. I was lucky, I got to know members across the aisle because I served on the Foreign Affairs Committee. And when we traveled for meetings in other countries, we had time together on flights in other countries where we actually got to know each other in a way that we didn't when we were in Washington. The other thing is, if you look at the way members of Congress sit, the Democrats sit on one side of the room, the Republicans sit on the other, and that's true in committee hearings. We don't even sit next to each other in committee hearings, so you don't have that sort of natural conversation that you might have.
It's like broken up lunch tables in the cafeteria.
Exactly. And there were suggestions that you mix people up. On Foreign Affairs, we had a lot of classified briefings where there was no assigned seating. And that was often a time when we could sit next to somebody on the other side of the aisle and get to talk before the meeting started. So there should be more of an emphasis on figuring out how people can work with members on the other side. But of course, compromise is often seen today as a dirty word. We need to get back to a situation where people understand the only way you're going to make progress in Congress is through compromise.
It's interesting the way you're describing it. I feel like it's almost a compelling argument for like the opposite of what a lot of people see as the issue of Congress, that it's people, look at Congress and say, oh, these folks in D.C., it's the swamp. They're not really in the real America. But I think you're pointing to something that is compelling, at least to my ears, that's in order for Congress to really be able to get stuff done, these people who are working together. I mean, we all saw during the pandemic, if nothing else, that working remotely is tough, and really meeting people in person and knowing people on a deep level is important for trust and compromise.
Absolutely. I went to one dinner. I was invited to a dinner at some restaurant with a group of a bipartisan group. And there were sort of rules. When you walked into the room, you had to sit next to somebody who wasn't in your party. You couldn't talk about this, that, or the other issue. Those people who were at that dinner, the next time I saw them walking through the tunnels or the hallways, I could say hello to them in a different way. I actually knew a little bit about them from the conversations we had at that dinner. We should probably have more of that in Congress, but time is so precious there. It's difficult to do that.
As we look ahead to the next year, are there specific things in Congress that either of you are keeping close eye on in terms of major issues, major pieces of legislation? What do you think Americans should be paying attention to in Congress?
The Social Security system is facing a looming insolvency in a few years, and that is something that in the past we've had bipartisan support for solutions. The last time Social Security really was on the brink of insolvency back in the 1980s during the Reagan administration, Democrats and Republicans were able to come together and pass legislation to protect the system. And that is one that is really not on the immediate agenda, but I think it will be an issue that receives more attention in the coming years.
I think depending on what the Supreme Court does with tariffs, we're going to see legislation coming out of Congress to deal with the imposition of tariffs willy-nilly and sort of figure out how we can have an economy where there's more stability, because businesses don't plan 3 months ahead. They plan 5 and 10 years ahead, and they need the stability that we haven't seen because of the tariffs to really plan their businesses going future. I also think we're going to see, we have labor shortages, and those are going to become more acute. When I was in Congress, I chaired a subcommittee on workforce shortages. And every segment that we brought in to talk about where they're having challenges hiring people saw that there are enormous challenges. And I think Jim Farley of Ford Motor Company recently went public and said he's got some enormous number of good paying jobs that pay more than $120,000 a year that he can't fill with American workers. Those are factory jobs that are staying open because there are not enough workers to fill those jobs. So I think we're going to see the need to address some of the workforce issues if companies are able to create the kind of growth that they need to stabilize the economy.
I want to wrap up with one other question that is Congress adjacent, but very much thinking about, our politics in the year, 2-3 years ahead. Congress is also a source of where so many of the party's leaders come from. Not all of the party's leaders, but many. And, you mentioned Bernie Sanders earlier. J.D. Vance had served in the Senate. As we're in this moment where Trump is entering his lame duck phase, the Democrats seem to be somewhat leaderless. Are there figures in Congress that either of you are really keeping a close eye on or feeling surprised by or excited by in terms of giving either party a new sense of direction or energy, at least?
I'll defer to Kathy on that.
There are lots of great members of Congress. I mean, one of the things that impressed me when I was there is I got to know people who had really interesting backgrounds, incredible areas of expertise, were in Congress for the right reason because they wanted to represent their constituents and they wanted to get things done for the American people. Those workhorses, they refer to, there are show horses and there are workhorses. Those workhorses often aren't reported on in the press, and they're busy sort of doing the hard work of representing their constituents and trying to get legislation passed. But there are certain members of Congress who you see rise to the top in leadership in Congress. And there are also those who get a lot of attention in the press. They're charismatic, they're good on the road. We see a lot of those. I also think that we should be looking at our governor's offices because we see great leaders coming out of our gubernatorial offices. And I was just on a call with one of them, Roy Cooper, who's our 2-term governor, 4-term attorney general in North Carolina, is running for the Senate right now. And Roy is a great leader for a moderate state. He's led the state very, very well, and he understands what's important to the people he's represented. I think we're going to see that with a lot of different governors. And my feeling about what's going to happen, who's going to be the Democratic candidate for president, there are a lot of great Democrats out there. We're going to see a bunch of them jump in the ring. I hope to see a very robust presidential primary system where all kinds of people get in there and let them fight it out and let the best person rise to the top.
I completely agree. I think when Americans are frustrated with Washington, they often look to leaders at the state level. You think of Carter and Reagan and Clinton and George W. Bush. This is a pattern that we see all the time. That
all former governors.
All former governors. And Washington can seem like a partisan morass. And Americans often want a pragmatic leader that can get things done. And a good place to show how government can work is in state houses and in the gubernatorial offices. And events are going to intrude. There may be foreign policy crises, whether the economy improves or whether ultimately we see the tariffs and the lack of immigration and uncertainty of the business environment end up pulling down the American economy. The way in which the 2028 presidential election is going to be framed, it's way too early to know. And the most successful candidates are going to be candidates that have strong leadership capacities and the ability to mobilize the coalition, but also seem like the answer to the problem that the ordinary American is facing at that moment.
Well, as you said, we are a long way away from the 2028 presidential election, and who knows where the parties most exciting and energizing leaders are going to come from. But in the meantime, there's a lot of actual governing that needs to get done by Congress. And thank you both for coming onto the show and helping us think through that institution and its place in our politics right now a little more deeply.
Thanks so much for having me.
Happy to be with you.
This episode was produced by me, Dan Richards. Our theme music is by Henry Bloomfield, with additional music from the Blue Dot Sessions. If you like this show, leave us a rating and review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps others to find us. And if you haven't subscribed to Trending Globally, please do that too. If you have any questions or comments or ideas for guests or topics for the show, send us an email at trendingglobally@brown.edu. Again, that's all one word, trendingglobally@brown.edu. We are going to take a short winter break, but we will be back in 2026 with some all new episodes of Trending Globally. Thanks for listening.